Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is part 3 of our More Than Reactionary biblical series. Today we'll be discussing the sexual marketplace. So, from the top, I think it's best to describe the 3 ways in which the sexual marketplace has historically been regulated. We have monogamy, which is one man and one woman at a time, varying on a spectrum from strict to not so strict. Then we have polygyny, where one man can be legally married to more than one woman. And then we have what is called, Jack Donahue popularized it, the bonobo society, where there's no, everybody's equally available to everyone else sexually. And it's more for social activities than anything else. Because with monogamy and polygyny, it's still primarily procreation oriented. And just as a cursory definition, a sort of Judeo-Christian sexual morality would be one where any sexual relationships outside of marriage are immoral, and the purpose of marriage is primarily procreation. I think it's fairly well known to most people what the particulars of Christian sexual morality are, so I don't see the need to go into much detail about that. Now, the other thing that needs to be made is there's de facto and sort of implicit polygyny. So, for example, like in the state of Utah, before the United States forced it to give up polygyny, it was legally allowed to have more than one woman as your wife. So today, the U.S. system, it seems to be pretty much unregulated, but there's elements of all 3. So in one sense, you can only legally be married to one woman, or one man, as it turns out. So Mormonism is still on the rocks. But since nobody really cares about extramarital sexual relationships, there's de facto polygyny, where you have lots of men, high-status men, monopolizing lots of the women, right? So it may not be a sort of a legally official arrangement that's recognized like in the Middle East, but it's something that's de facto happening. And you have a sort of de facto bonobo society as well, where people just kind of are equally openly available to everyone else. Marriage seems to be a bit of an anachronism right now, legally speaking, since it isn't actually enforced. And I think those are the main ways in which the sexual marketplace can be regulated. And in this context, the modern United States is an admixture of all 3, at least in an implicit sense. In a legal sense, of course, there's no polygyny, and you are legally married to, you can choose to be legally married to one person. But there's, again, implicitly, there's all sorts of arrangements that are illustrative of all 3 forms of the regulation of the sexual marketplace currently existing in the North American context, in part because I don't think it is regulated. So what are your thoughts on that, Anarcho?
So the monogamous unit is the cornerstone of the West's rise. When you look at the strongest civilizations on Earth, the 2 main ones that come to mind were China, the first world hegemon, and then shortly after that, several Western empires came to take its place. China had a very strong emphasis on the family, on a monogamous family unit, through with the wife and the husband had very specific relations to each other under Confucianism. And we see in the Christian West this pattern, which was not very well established in many pagan societies, which is why we can explain why pagan societies never rose to the greatness of Christian society. It is this relationship that the husband and the wife have to each other. It's tempting to say egalitarian, but I think universalist is the key word to use here, in that there's a universal relationship and specialization of duties that you have with between the husband and the wife that allows both of them to help each other thrive in a way that causes the least amount of jealousy and infighting, as with polygamous societies, and as a way, and and as the worry I find in modern society, Todd, you alluded to marriage being expanded with gay marriage, but I mean the thing is, because the liberal notion of marriage is just that it's any kind of it's just another contract that consenting adults should be allowed to enter into at any time. Polygamy does absolutely follow legalized polygamy polygyny. It's that it wouldn't necessitate one man to multiple women, but we all know that's inevitably what would happen anyway. And what since that completely follows from the liberal argument of consenting adults being allowed to enter any contract, it's the slippery slope to basically eradicating marriage, which is the cornerstone of the West, is definitely set in place.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Master Sanders?
I think Anarcho probably summed up what I would have said on that.
Okay. Logos.
Yeah, I think I'm good too. This just seems like a summary of the different systems, and I think everybody's covered it. Let's move on to the next topic.
All right. So the thing that we see now, there's lots of pathologies that have arisen in society as a result of, as I will attempt to argue in this episode, deviations from the strict monogamous norms that used to dominate in the United States. So, for example, in his work Coming Apart, Charles Murray writes about the decline of the white middle class. And he specifically states in interviews and in the book that he wanted to limit it to white people only, because if he included Hispanics and Latinos and Negroes and other minorities, people might be tempted to dismiss his findings as saying, "Oh, well, that's not environmental or socialism or cultural. It's just these minorities." So he just limits it to white people. And he points out that prior to the sexual revolution, both the lower classes, if you will, and the upper classes, if you will, had an agreed understanding of monogamy, basically Christian idea of marriage that had persisted in the United States since its first settlement. And he points out that led to social capital. And the example he gives of social capital is this sort of stereotypical, Midwestern town with 24 kids, running around, and none of the parents are concerned because they always know that at least one parent is watching the kids at some point during in the village, in the town, and that they're all the parents have agreed that if any one parent sees one of the children acting out, they can step in and are empowered to adjudicate the dispute at that point. And there's this level of trust and self-respecting control that's present in this system that we're now sadly lacking. 70% of African American children are born out of wedlock. I think it's something like 60% Latino, and it's almost 50% for like middle and lower class whites. It's pretty bad. And he points out that the wealthy whites, the ones at the top, still more or less are conforming to some version of the sexual norms in marriage that came before. And that's sustaining their high income earnings, their high positions in society and government, business, culture, and not the case at all in the lower classes of the within the white demographic. And they're in fact converging on the pathologies is commonly associated with minority communities. We also see, even it was famously said, Barack Obama would talk about how black children being raised without fathers was a tremendous detriment. And he wished his own father had been present. So, I mean, it's a problem that's across the aisle that's seen as a problem by both right and left. And the solution amongst sociologists is fairly consistent. So in conversations with Bill Crystal, it's a YouTube channel he runs where he interviews intellectuals, mostly on the right. But in this case, he interviewed Putnam, who's on the left, who wrote Bowling Alone. And Putnam in this interview says that pretty much all the sociologists agree, right, left, and center, that the number one factor for youth delinquency is a broken household without a father. And that the traditional norms that we'd had before were preventing these kinds of pathologies and giving children the best possible start. The three rules that you have to follow if you want to be successful is don't have sex outside of marriage, finish school, and get a job. Those three things, you'll be successful. And of course, I'm sorry, not get a job. Coming from an intact household, don't have sex outside of marriage, and finish your education. And we see in these communities with these values that's not happening, and it's leading to all of these terrible pathologies that are literally creating painful externalities that we are grappling to deal with. And from a libertarian perspective, leading to the rise of the welfare state. Because how often do we hear for the children as an excuse to justify ever more government programs, which of course are the very same government programs creating this perverse incentive in the first place for the children to have broken households. And so the evidence to me seems fairly clear that the traditional arrangements that we once had were prerequisites for social capital, for children growing up to be functional members of society with every possible advantage that they're not having now. And so because we've deviated from this norm of strict monogamy, which was the norm in the United States, we have the rise of these terrible pathologies. And strict monogamy as well, and J.D. Unwin's book, Sex and Culture, highlights that any sort of advanced civilizing process is concurrent with strict monogamous processes. And to an extent, as society deviates from those monogamous norms, the process of decivilization begins. So we have a strong amount of theoretical and sociological and empirical evidence that the strict monogamous household is the best situation for creating civilizational forces, having children grow up in environments that allow them for maximum flourishing. So I'll start with you, Logos. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Wow, that was a lot. There's like several layers of analysis we want to do on this. First, before we bring children into it, let's just start with the idea of marriage as an economic factor. So my research is primarily on housing when I do economic research, and I'm noticing a trend in the United States where rent-income ratios are increasing year by year. Now, one thing that marriage can do to help alleviate this problem, and I'm not saying that, bootstraps, get married, you'll succeed. I'm saying that one thing that could help in this, helping people get out of the rental trap, is to form stable households with two incomes, helping to save up for a home instead of paying the landlord. Because rents, especially in the urban areas, are just going up year after year after year. Articles on this are very plentiful all over Google. Now, one thing I'm noticing for current trends, say after 2005 around the crash, compared to other times, is when rents would get high, with the next decade, they'd usually get low because people would move out of rentals in the urban centers into housing and so on. And so what you'd get like a cycle of ups and downs of rents along an upward trend of rent income ratios over the long term. This isn't happening now. What's happening is rents are high, the market tries to stabilize itself, but so many people are getting caught in the rent trap where the rent is so high they can't save up enough income effectively to afford a house, which is prohibiting them from exiting the market, leading to a very pathological market. And the only way I can think for people to get out of this reasonably quickly, so the market can attempt to fix itself, is if you have two incomes all going toward paying the rent and then everything saving up to get into a house. Now, we've tried circumventing marriage to have things like this. You have roommates, 4 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment or a 2-bedroom apartment, trying to pool their resources so the rents are cheaper for all of them and they can save up for whatever they need to do. That's good. It's not perfect, because one of the problems is all 4 of the different roommates are probably moving into their own houses, and so they're saving it for 4 different accounts. They're still saving it for 4 times the amount of money so that they all move out to their own dwellings instead of 2 or more people pooling their incomes to move into a house where they have more control over a mortgage. They don't have to worry about the rent jumping up every year, so on and so on and so forth. So before we even talk about children, the sociological detriments of children outside of marriage, you have the economic factor. And when it comes to housing, that can be a very, very big one. So I just wanted to start there. As far as with children, I think that's also another interesting point. Well, I kind of lost my train of thought because that one was kind of difficult. How about we let somebody else talk next?
Yeah, sure. Mr. Sanders, how about your thoughts on this?
No, I believe I mentioned this quote in a previous stream, but I think it bears repeating now since we're talking about some of the economic consequences of the deregulation of the sexual marketplace. J.G. McCullough, who is both a conservative commentator in Canada as well as an open homosexual, actually wrote on this. He said, the most fashionable thing in the world is to claim to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative, yet the two are not so easily separated. In the absence of strong institutions like marriage and the nuclear family, citizens inevitably become more atomized and helpless, and thus inclined to turn toward big government as their source of provision, structure, and comfort. It may make a sort of libertarian sense to argue that the state has no interest in how people organize their lives, but the state certainly benefits when they do so poorly. Now, whether or not we actually advocate for the government to regulate the sexual marketplace is another matter, but there is something to the effect of the detriments or the pathologies, as you mentioned, of this sort of weird polygynous bonobo society we live in. Is, as you mentioned, children going up without fathers or without any significant parental influence, or stable households that lead to delinquency. And because of this, we have more incentives for government programs to either to alleviate some of the worst conditions of poverty, or to just contain some of the worst results of poverty, which is special education programs or opportunities for people who have come from poor backgrounds. But the point is, whether state involvement in these issues, whether it's benevolent or malevolent, we see that the government inevitably grows and inevitably becomes much more authoritative in the lives of families, regardless how they're structured, in the absence of fully well-structured homes. So one of the things that should be concerning, particularly for anyone who is concerned about things such as property rights, personal liberty, and just even if those outside the sustaining of a viable Western culture, the pathologies that have resulted from this deregulation of the sexual marketplace will inevitably lead to greater government becoming more and more involved in the lives of its citizens, and in a worst case scenario, which I fear, to a increasingly more totalitarian level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if women aren't raising the children, the state is, and that's a. So, what are some of your thoughts, Anarcho?
Yeah, you cannot talk about the issue of wealth inequality in this country without going to the increasing levels of fatherless households and even divorce rates, because ultimately it's not. While we can discuss economic policy all day, we have in the first episode, and of course, as we established in that episode, since the family is the primary unit of an economy, and by dissolving strong family ties, marital bonds, and succumbing parent-child relationships, we cannot hope to have our children equipped with these social and even like educational skills necessary to make it into the middle or the upper class. It all stems from this issue of not and while we don't need to take a top-down authoritarian approach to sex, like it never has to go that far. It really needs to be a matter of not enabling such behavior. So we need welfare reform to not encourage this fatherless household predicament, and it's also we'll also need to prevent marriage from being expanded to cover polygamous couples, because if that happens, we'll basically, I mean, we're already seeing this with Muslim migration, because Islam is very condoning and encouraging of the act of polygyny, and we're starting to see a rise of cases of that in the first world, and we see a large increase in the welfare state to accompany those polygynous Muslim minorities. And it's a mess, and the government needs to take a firm step against things like that. Otherwise, we'll end up undoing ourselves, and we'll be in for a lot more economic disorder unless we emphasize such monogamous bonds.
Exactly. Logos, did you remember what you wanted to bring up?
Yeah. Another quick point about the children. This is a point where both the left and the right actually can have some overlap, whether they know it or not. So you talked about the sociologists, but even the left-wing politicians. Notice that one of the big talking points on the left is paid maternity leave in the corporations. Now, the way the left is seeing this, right or wrong, is that the corporations are not allowing these stable households to form. Wages haven't been keeping up with inflation. There's a lot of downward pressure on the economy, which is forcing two-parent households to go to work, and all that sort of stuff. So children are being left by the wayside. Now, it's questionable how much of some of the left's own policies are responsible for some of the problems we see here. But take that as you may. Everybody knows there's a problem. They see there's a problem, but what they see is what they want to do is they want corporations to fix what they're breaking. So they have to pay for the paid maternity leave. They have to pay for mothers to stay home with their children, or fathers, or whoever, some parent to stay home with their child, and that's got to be subsidized by corporations because they're the ones that are breaking it. And it just struck me as I was thinking about this earlier today that everybody knows there's a problem, but what's interesting is, where we disagree on where the problem comes from and how to fix it.
Yes, exactly. Now, one interesting element here is that when we look at both across the spectrum in the United States, right, center, left, we mostly agree on private property norms, free markets, representative government, civil, rights. People have rights, and so you just can't, arrest somebody without a cause or anything like that. There's this. It's not quite as pronounced as it used to be, but this broad American consensus of free enterprise and transparent representative government. And these kinds of systems that we have, people assume are completely disconnected from any sort of sexual marketplace, even though we know that in Northwest Europe and in North America, you had a strict Protestant sexual marketplace in force. We see this in the book, which is a series of essays by sociologists called Culture Matters by I forget the author's name, Samuel P. Huntington III. And with Culture Matters, they talk about how these norms that developed in North America and Northwest Europe, including the sexual norms, help lay the foundations for what we have today. And I think one of the most interesting explanatory value of the Christian, quote unquote, traditional Judeo-Christian nuclear family is to the rise of the modern economic order that we all are so indebted to, as far as our livelihoods, our abundance and plenty. So in I think it was 1980s, Jack Goody did a study of the changes in marriage that took place in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Calls it the marriage revolution. This is later picked up on by Deepak Lal. He points out that the Eurasian family pattern was one of, the paterfamilias, large extended families, concubinage, and the whole point was to keep wealth concentrated in the hands of a few men. So they allow for kinship marriage, close kinship, so you could marry a cousin or something, to keep the money and property in the family. You could marry concubines to keep an heir going. And so all of these things were set up to allow for having property centralized in the hands of a few. Now, beginning with Gregory the First, and then I think the Gregory the 13th, the Catholic Church began to issue what Deepak law calls marriage revolutions in order to break up the holdings of these large families. Now, Goody argues that this was done in order to siphon off the money to the church, because they childless people would then donate it to the church. I don't know one way or the other. It might be putting the cart before the horse. But what the byproduct of that was, when you could not marry close relatives, when concubinage was discouraged, it forced the younger men and the family to then split off and start new families. And then wealth could not be easily hoarded in the hands of a few, which led to the rise of, in say the 13th and 14th centuries, roughly financially independent households that allowed for competitive competition in the marketplace in a way that just didn't happen before, because all of the assets were tied down in the hands of a few people. And so it was this monogamous system that was the precondition for the market revolution, that was the precondition for the industrial revolution. And Goody and Law get into detail on this as to why they think that's the case. I think they make a compelling argument for that. And second of all, we can look at, okay, can the American system be maintained in another sexual marketplace? No, there's absolutely no evidence that it can be, and massive amounts of evidence to the contrary. So let's look at Latin America. For the past 200 years, Latin America has been attempting to imitate the United States, the United States Constitution, the freedom that comes with being a U.S. citizen, the economic development that the United States has, and they've all failed. Now, I'm not saying there's only one cause for this failure, but it is interesting that the sexual marketplace of Latin America is much different than that of the United States. Even historically, extramarital relations were not really frowned upon. In fact, with machismo, the aggressive predatory male persona of Latin America, it was expected and a point of pride to have extramarital relations and in fact seduce married women. So I guess that might be an implicit polygyny. While they didn't, of course, legally recognize it, except in the case of Mormons in Mexico, to my knowledge, there was a de facto polygyny where these powerful men would then, would then try to have as many women as possible. And we see that over the 200 years and the system is still in place now. In fact, the sexual revolution has merely exacerbated it. Latin America has not hardly advanced a step towards the United States in this process. We can also look at West African culture. So, for example, Thaddeus Russell, a leading libertarian advocate of libertinism, will mention that, West African culture, it's all the fun stuff, the jazz, the blues, and the rock and roll. Yeah, but West Africa is a dunghill racked by poverty, war, dictatorship, and crime. And again, we see that as the world in the post-World War II era has tried to imitate the success of the West, they've largely failed outside of maybe East Asia. But then again, they adopted Western norms. Japan did, Singapore did, and South Korea did. So not only is there strong historical evidence that the nuclear monogamous household led to the preconditions necessary for the market and hence industrial revolutions, but there is no evidence and a great deal of contradictory evidence stating that other forms of sexual marketplace regulation are incompatible with the maintenance of these principles. So I'll open up with you, Master Singers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I can't really add much to that except perhaps the observation that a level of domestic order leads to an orderly society. That an orderly society is one that ultimately leads to prosperity. Now, the benefit, of course, of having both parents in the household is, of course, you have the mutual influence of the mother who kisses your boo-boos, and you have the father that tells you to suck it up. You have to have both influences in your life in order to be a somewhat balanced and stable person. And the benefit of a monogamous household is that you do experience that order, that balance, and the stability that you need both on an intellectual and emotional level in order to be a productive member of society. And when you really don't have that level of discipline at home and balance you would have at home with a two-parent household. You can't. There's really no way for you to truly function outside of that in a way that is productive and orderly, that allows for allows for prosperity. And these other cultures, again, as you mentioned, is that because there aren't really that many, if at all, restrictions on sexual conduct, which in turn affects the structures of families. Are we not surprised when these sort of societies, regardless of whether they're in Africa or South America or even in parts of Europe, that we shouldn't be surprised that that ultimately disorderliness, poverty, and chaos are what result.
Exactly. What are your thoughts on Anarcho?
Yeah, I think this is a fairly straightforward universal phenomenon that the man is a very jealous and envious creature, and this is true in both economics with material things as well as in the sexual marketplace. With the what do they call it? I'll just say the incel who's always jealous of the Chad, and this. To focus on incels for a moment here, this is a phenomenon that could only have grown in shadow of the sexual revolution, because it wasn't commonplace. First of all, this notion of a Chad. You mentioned, Todd, earlier the Latin American, how Latin American culture tends to have a more condoning attitude towards this machismo, and I don't think that Chad is a result of that, despite all the Hispanic immigration we've had to this country. But I think it is the product of the sexual revolution that when you embrace this social liberalism, this libertinism, the one who can, the player who plays the game the best ends up, gets the most adulation, and the person who can, acquire the most amount of chicks in this total free marketplace of sexual gratification is, then we're going to naturally see, a rise in this disrespect for stable familiar bonds. Whereas before you had that, you've always, of course, you're going to have this Chad type character, this guy who's always going to be trying to seduce women. The problem is that society had always castigated that kind of character, and thus could always keep it under firm wraps. And if you keep the standard as one man and one woman, to either be dating or married, then we're not, we won't acquire this new rift with the incel versus trad, and this is I'm mostly describing the ill effects it has for men. This isn't good for women either, because Chad is not usually characterized as a very giving, as a very sensitive or a caring person, and this has left a lot of men sexually unsatisfied. So it's a lot of women emotionally uncared for.
Yeah, Logos, what are your thoughts?
I got a couple. So the first one, I guess, is with the incel problem. I think some of that problem may be with more than just the sexual marketplace. Another thing that's occurred to me as I thought about this problem is globalization has really shifted the labor market in a binary way. So it used to be back in the day where companies weren't able to broadcast a position all over the world and say, we want the best of everybody to come fill our position, then you get hundreds of thousands of applicants looking for this job. Back in the day, the companies had a more local broadcast for employment. So one of the things that's happening because of the globalized marketplace of employment is two things. First off, the average ability of the applicant is increasing because the job pool is increasing. You can apply all over the world and pick from the very best to apply. The other thing that's happening is as companies become more multinational and advertising to new markets becomes such a huge deal, um, increasingly what happens is it's not just the smart or hardworking people that are successful. That might get them somewhere to like a mid-management position or something like that. But what really pushes people over the top increasingly is their social status, how well they can articulate, how well they are, what's the word I'm looking for? How persuasive they are, how good at talking they are. There's a good word. I just can't remember what it is. It's just driving me nuts. Anyway, those types of people. Thank you. That's a good word. You got that. All right. So those people are the labor market's being binarily distributed for people who have some good smarts, some good work ethic, but are also very eloquent and good at pitching a product and holding board meetings and convincing investors to invest, so on and so on and so forth. And everybody who's got what it took to be successful in several decades past economies, which weren't so multinational, but didn't quite have the eloquence. So this is increasingly leading to a generation of people who, since they're not necessarily the most eloquent people, maybe they have a harder time approaching women in general. Now, back in the day, they had something to offer because when jobs were more local and they were the best that could apply at the time, they were smart, they were hardworking, and they'd do their local employer proud. And because marketing wasn't so heavily emphasized, it wasn't a big of a deal that they weren't the most eloquent person on the planet. They'd still do well. And when they'd approach a woman, they'd have a job, they'd have money, they'd have something to offer, some sort of stability. Well, now it's a 1-2 punch because now since they're not eloquent, they're not getting as far, and since they're not as eloquent, they're not as well at approaching women. Those two things together are leading to a quite the problem, which might be driving this incel problem. So we can talk about just the sexual marketplace changing, but I think a part of that also is the globalized job market. There's another point I want to make, but now I forgot what it was again. So I guess I'll continue the conversation with the next person.
Okay. One interesting, to sort of springboard off some of the problems that Anarcho mentioned, a very interesting show that I wrote is an episode of the Phil Donahue show where Warren Farrell and George Gilder discuss men, marriage, and the sexual marketplace. And they have different perspectives on how to solve it, but I think they both bring up interesting ideas. So, for example, the incel problem that you mentioned, Anarcho, and then you jumped off of Logos, is in the same way that women are sexualized as actresses and supermodels, men are objectified as status success objects, like you're president of a corporation, a CEO, you're a chairman on the bank, you're a politician, or you're an athlete, you're successful. And so women have expectations due to hypergamy, the idea that they want to be with a high status male because they believe he can protect them. They go for these high status males, and that's the expectation that the male has to bring to the table. The fact is, most men are never going to be in those positions and can't be in those positions, and most of the women that want those men are going to be overlooked for more attractive targets for the men that are in that position. And so they're in this locked position. And I know people who know women in their 30s and 40s who are waiting for this, high status male who's never coming because he's looking for a woman 20 years younger than her. But she won't look for the men who are less higher. I mean, they work hard, they earn money, they're not louts, but they're not in that status position. And so there's this unnaturally high expectation. And this is what Farrell's pointing at. I don't agree with his solution. He wants to go more in a leftward direction towards, accepting, alternative lifestyles. But he does bring up a good point there. And the other point is the same with men, as he points out. Again, they have to give up the ideal of the supermodel wife. This isn't going to happen for most men. The other problem, though, is in a competitive co-ed marketplace. Not sexual, just a regular marketplace. What you end up having is another problem because you have men who, say, the woman who's waiting for the CEO or the bank manager to marry them, and they won't. Men that they might otherwise have a chance with are either A, intimidated by them because they're promoted higher up than them, or B, they view them with confrontation because they view them as a competitor that's making it harder for them to get a job and to advance in their own career. So then that woman is not only not having options to the men above her because they've already been picked, but the men below her that might actually have a chance, they're both not looking at each other for that purpose. So it creates a lot of lonely, angry, frustrated people. And again, these problems, there's always been lonely, frustrated people. But the point is, it wasn't a sort of systemic problem that society was dealing with in the more traditional gender norms that the United States was known for. Prevented a lot of these problems because marriage historically was not for love or for pleasure or for whatever. It was a sort of socioeconomic contract, right? Wealth would be transferred from one family to the other. As Aristotle pointed out in the Politics, it was seen as the state in a petri dish. The state grows out of the family, so the family was sort of like a mini state, and you get that to work right, and then by extension, the more families that are functioning, you have a functioning state. And the other thing is interesting too, a lot of non-standard sexual practices like homosexuality, incel, and other things are the result of polygyny. Because if you look at anthropology and history, societies that encourage polygyny often have this because you basically have men that are locked out. They don't have access to women. And so they resort to these more self-destructive methods of getting sexual release. And so in many ways, a lot of these alternative lifestyles that the left has been pushing on us are in some sense the result of the material conditions of the deregulating of the sexual marketplace, which is defaulting on polygyny, at least in some cases. So what are your thoughts on that, Mr. Sanders?
Yeah, I think it's not just incels. Well, if we often assume that incels are just men, right? But if we're going to be a little more specific, perhaps the phenomena of MGTOW and feminism, or at least third wave feminism that we see on college campuses. We're seeing an increasing number of both men and women, thanks to the deregulation of the sexual marketplace, becoming increasingly isolated from each other because of, as you mentioned, ridiculous expectations or unrealistic expectations, but also the idea that sex is an end in and of itself. We have people identifying themselves because of their sexuality, whether they're homosexual, bisexual, and some newer ones pansexual, what have you. People are increasingly identifying who they are as people by their sexual preferences. And when that becomes more part of one's identity, more so than things like what you can do, who you are as a person, and you're in a position where you can't really have your sexual needs fulfilled, or at least immediately, or in the way that you would like them fulfilled, you have an increasingly number of both men and women who, serving sex as their god and not being satisfied by their god, are becoming increasingly isolated from each other and bitter. And so you have entire segments, particularly of young people, that are frustrated with the way that this system promised by this liberalization of sexual ideas and sexual morality, that they've been gypped. Like they haven't gotten their piece of the pie, so to speak. They haven't gotten what society owes them, because after all, if having a sexual partner or having your sexual needs satisfied whenever you want to and however you want it is a good in and of itself, and they're seeing their life matching up against that, and they're saying that their life is not reflecting what society is telling them, then again, that's the only result is people like MGTOW, third wave feminists, and just incels in general. So I think the problem is not just the fact that sex is being liberalized, but the fact that sexual gratification is being viewed as a good in and of itself. And this combination is ultimately deadly, not just for young people and the growing distrust of the genders growingly distrusting each other, but for the survival of our society as a whole.
Yeah. Logos, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you want to add?
Yeah, I remember the point I forgot previously, and I have another point too quickly. The point I forgot previously was actually precluded the MGTOW discussion and the incel discussion. It was about the more polygamous societies and their economic development. And something I think is interesting to point out is opportunity cost. The longer time you spend looking for sexual partners and going between sexual partner, sexual partner, sexual partner, trying to woo more women, the less time and effort you'll have to spend in learning a trade, advancing your economic, workload, your productivity, becoming a staple in your community. Right? You only have a finite amount of time per day to do stuff, and so it stands to reason the more of it you spend trying to woo women, the less time you'll spend making your community better and being an economic participant, learning a trade, so on and so forth. The other point I wanted to make is about the incel problem we're talking about now, um, and that's about one thing to consider on top of just the changing sexual norms and the liberalization of the sexual market. But again, I have to keep harping on globalization. If the average length of time to get a good steady job keeps increasing as more and more it's harder and harder to fill out more job applications and get jobs. They're saying that bachelor's degree might be the new high school diploma, within the coming years, if it's not already. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means give it 3 more decades, a bachelor's degree might literally become the next high school diploma, entirely worthless. So if you want a good secure job in a changing global marketplace, I mean, the trades seem to be doing all right. And so if you can find a good local trade and you can do that and get some money, that's great. Thing I've heard about trades is trades are really, really good at ramping up quickly to a middle income, 50, 60, 70,000 a year. I don't know if a lot of people in the trades will make the 6-figure incomes. So I don't know. Trades are interesting. I got to look more into that. But for everybody that's not a trade person like me, my hand coordination is absolutely terrible. I just can't do trades very easily. So people like me that are more academically inclined, instead of physically inclined, moving things around and tinkering with stuff, it takes us longer and longer and longer to get a job, more degrees, more training, more certificates, so on and so forth. And what that means is you have 2 options. Either A, you can say screw it, try to get a wife, date, have children, while you're hoping to eventually climb that ladder and finish your degree, in which case you could risk raising your child in a very, very unstable economic environment where you might have a job, be able to provide for them 1 year, a recession hits or something like that happens, and boom, you're laid off. What are you going to do? Or you can wait and put off that longer and longer and longer, as you try to get a secure footing in the economy before you start having a wife and kid, so you can guarantee the ability to secure their existence, as they grow up and so on. Now, for men, that might not be so bad, putting off sex and marriage and all that stuff, because I don't know, from what studies I've read and stuff like that, women on average marry men 7 years their senior anyway. Men don't tend to get that less attractive as they age. Sean Connery types that are older, women still really like them. Patrick Stewart, all these people that can still woo women at an older age, but women have the opposite problem. I mean, the more successful a man is, like Todd pointed out, the more likely they are to want a younger supermodel type, not an older type. So women and men competing in the workforce together have this unfortunate asymmetry where women have like a kind of a ticking time bomb to get in a relationship of sorts. Men have the opposite problem. So on the one hand, it does cause some stress and make it really, really hard for people to start families, trying to deal with, taking it longer and longer and longer to get that first secure job. And on the other hand, it does affect both asymmetrically. So hopefully both sides can get a compromise on this, because it's hurting them both.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Anarcho?
Yeah, I definitely find that the entry of the integration of genders into the workforce, while I'm not, obviously we can allow each gender to pursue their own. I am somewhat of a libertarian-minded person. I don't want to force anyone not to work, but we definitely see with the rise, especially with globalization and the integration, which basically forced the genders to enter the workforce, even though a lot of people credit that to feminism. I would say feminism was really just the mask that kind of, it was basically the ideology that helped cover sort of the broader neoliberal scheme that made where a man could no longer support his household by himself and his wife to become a worker as well. That's caused a lot of, we don't really appreciate just how important it is for a woman to, it's not even that she can't, like, plenty of women took up jobs in like 1950s America. You had plenty of women, after all of their children had basically grown up to a point where they didn't need to be in the house after after school, and they could where they had all basically grown up, at least the high school level. Many women enter the workforce in their 40s. It was very important for them to take those early years of marriage off, to raise the children that really provides for just unexplainably important skills. Even just for instance, like kids in the left likes to credit, for instance, Finland for achieving high education results. Finnish kids don't enter school till 7. They're with their folks, and granted, they in their case might have both parents over, but it's not even relevant. The point I'm trying to make is that mom spending time with your children is an indispensable part of a functioning society. It's been one of the great cornerstones of the West's success is having the mother in the household to take care of the child. And even if we want it to be the father, it has to be at least one parent taking care of the children, and usually it will be the mother. But and just relying on daycare centers and to make up for that, it's not enough, and we see that it's not enough in our modern society.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is we are beginning to see, with the likes of Jordan Peterson and what is loosely called the alt-right, a sort of growing realization that strict monogamy is necessary for society to work. I think it was within the past few weeks, Jordan Peterson was on the Joe Rogan show, and he mentioned that we need to have culturally enforced monogamy. Now, of course, he's a bit of a libertarian, and so won't say the state, both either at the local or the federal level, should have anything to say about this, or at least not too much to say about it. But of course, that was enough to get Joe Rogan uncomfortable. So we are beginning to see a growing realization of the necessity of it from the sociological and anthropological data. But the point that I would see with, say, someone like Jordan Peterson or other libertarians see the importance of, liberal/libertarian who see the importance of traditional family values, is they'll say that, well, we need to have it socially enforced but not legally enforced. And this is really just kind of double talk. I mean, imagine if you were to tell a liberal/libertarian, well, property right norms, it's all well and good, they should be socially encouraged, but there shouldn't be any legal protection for private property right norms. They go apoplectic, they go crazy, because they intuitively know that you could not preserve the kinds of private property norms that they want without some form of legal prohibition against transgressing those norms. And I think the next realization for someone like Jordan Peterson or the alt-right would be that, yes, cultural enforcement is extremely important, but that alone isn't going to do it. If the same way that cultural enforcement alone will not maintain private property right norms, cultural enforcement alone will not preserve monogamous marriage norms. And there is going to need to be, at the state level, some laws disincentivizing non-monogamous relationships. Now, how that would be done now as opposed to the way it was done 70 years ago, that's a whole different kettle of fish, because things are not like they were 70 years ago. So just copying what happened then now wouldn't necessarily work. I tend to think what Hoppe outlines in his chapter on conservatism and democracy, the guy that failed, chapter 10, is actually a pretty good summation of how one might go around trying to restore both cultural and legal enforcing mechanisms of traditional monogamous marriages in the modern age. What are some of your thoughts on that, Logos?
Um, I don't know. The legal enforcement, that's a kettle of fish. I don't know about just yet. I think that we're on the right track with government programs. I think in the newest GOP tax bill, they upgraded the amount of tax return that married couples can get, married couples with kids can get, so on and so on and so forth. Um, and I think that you can, with some light-handed incentives, really encourage people to do these things. But the thing is, people have to know about it, right? So there are all sorts of tax incentives for marriage, children, owning a house instead of renting, and lots of other stuff that's supposed to encourage, classically good citizen-like behavior from Aristotle and so on and so forth. But most people are just so unaware of how the tax code works, they don't even know that these things are in there. So I think we might have some of the tools. First, we need to mass market the fact that they're there and they are encouraging people to do these things for their own good. And once people know about them, then you just flip the switches and see how well you can get people to do it. I'm not opposed 100% to legal enforcement. I'm just not ready to take the dive just yet.
Okay, Master Sanders.
Well, I mean, again, this is sort of a tricky subject, but there are some practical things that you can do, at least practical, maybe not being able to pass this legislation, but things that I think that could be done that would greatly deter some of the practices that do go on. First of all, is that I would probably end no-fault divorce. The legalization of no-fault divorce in many cases, perhaps, and that made divorce a lot more easier. It made it a lot more easier for certain couples to, for reasons other than, let's say, abuse or infidelity, and is opposed to incentivizing perhaps either sticking together for the children or finding ways to cope with problems that exist within a marriage. Perhaps one thing would be, again, to end no-fault divorce. Another thing would probably be to find ways to curb abortion. That's probably one of the more practical ones in this day and age, particularly in the direction the Supreme Court seems to be going in. That would obviously, disincentivize abortion and allow for states to regulate that front. One thing that we really don't talk about in our culture, because we have a difficult time imagining this in a legal sense, but one thing that was very much the case in South Korea for the longest time, which was having adultery in and of itself a criminal offense. Now, how can you come up with a law that would be in and of itself satisfactory and having minimal loopholes? Something that could be easily abused, of course, is another problem altogether. But there are steps that have been in place prior to the 1960s that were legal, that were considered fairly the norm. And thanks to a series of more liberalizing state laws and the Supreme Court, have been taken away. So it's not like we're creating some of these incentives out of thin air is nothing that hasn't existed ever in American history. Whether or not you can actually get them passed in this day, of course, is another question altogether. But we do have enough precedence in both our culture as well as other situations within the Western world and the Western influence world. I think that we could help get back to, or at least incentivize traditional marriage or traditional sexual relations, or at least strongly disincentivize abnormal sexual relations.
Yeah. Okay. Anarcho.
I would basically agree with most of that. I will only comment on no-fault divorce by saying that the idea does sound nice, even though I understand that would make some households miserable. I would say if we could have, maybe we might want to start just with the state. It's easier to convince the masses to have the state do something for you rather than prohibit you from doing something, even though those have to go hand in hand anyway. If the state could provide, and I believe it does provide marriage counseling to poorer families, I think that would be That would be a much better investment than welfare schemes, which actually encourage you not to have a man in the house, encourage single motherhood. Having, I think steps like that would probably be a good idea to encouraging, uh, you know, using economic and political resources to help encourage couples to stay together and to, especially if they have kids, I think is the most important thing to keep track of. Divorce is not something one general, but divorce with a household that has kids in it is even worse.
Mm-hmm. Well, nearing the end of the hour, we should probably wrap it up. So I guess we'll start with you, Anarcho, for final thoughts.
Okay, so we've we've discussed a lot of economics and politics in our discussion of the sexual marketplace. I would say that most uh, most of human endeavors in in our that most of human society comes from the family, and that the sexual marketplace right now is catered towards the individual. So, in the same way, capitalism, as we discussed in the first episode, is not conducive as an economic system towards the social goals of the social conservative. The same thing with the sexual revolution and the liberalization of sexual norms is by putting the individual as the basic unit of its analysis. It only cares about the temporary happiness of either genders to have one night of euphoric pleasure, but without any having to suffer the consequences and without having to uh, look at the broader social trends that such behavior leads to. And as a result, the destabilization of the libertarian society that encourages such behavior, of course, yields to greater dismay, and as well as economic ruin and wealth inequality, as we discussed before with Charles Murray coming apart. And I think the closer we get back to the social conservative mores and putting the family unit ahead of the individual, the faster we can come to sort of make America great again. If it was great ever great, it was great in when we had stable monogamous families, and we need to go back to that.
Okay, I'm Mr. Sanders.
Yeah, again, it's just we live in a society that is very atomized and very distrustful of each other. And while we are definitely not in a low trust society like most other non-Western countries are, I'm afraid that we are rapidly approaching this. And one of the areas, of course, that we have been is in the realm of sex and sexuality. Because we've individualized sex so much, and we've turned it into, instead of being something as being a duty to one's spouse or being something necessary for the propagation of the human species, we've turned into something that's purely self-focused, purely pleasurable. And as a result, we've turned it into something we're entitled to. And with this entitlement, coupled with the lack of community for regulation, the lack of stable homes, and the propagation of a very hypersexualized culture affecting both men and women, right? We're becoming, because of this, the result is a large number of younger people, of more frustrated older women and frustrated younger men who have no outlet, who cannot deal with their natural urges in a healthy environment, but at the same time worshiping it to the point where it's God. So unless we really, as a Western society, and I think we may be coming to that, I don't know, depending on who you believe, I think we may be coming slowly but surely to a re-regulation of the sexual marketplace, however that turns out. Unless we really begin to get a grip on this and go back to some level of standards when it comes to the expression of one's sexuality, this problem is only going to continue, and we'll have a larger number of childless, lonely adults.
Okay, Logos.
I think I've said most of what I want to say. I guess I'll just reiterate that you can't just look at the sexual marketplace as its own an island unto itself. You know, it doesn't change in a vacuum. It can change as a result of other forces that push on it. And some of the reasons that keep the things the way it is might be from some of those other forces as well. So unfortunately, you can't just look at the topic just in its own. You have to think about the economy, where are the social incentives, how easy is it for people to marry, settle down, make families, how easy is it to afford housing, what's job security looking like? All these questions are all interlinked. You can't look out any of one of them without looking at all the other ones. So I think that we do need a new social emphasis on how we think about sex and the like. I do think we also need to solve the economic problems. If you try to fix one without addressing the other one, the solution is going to go nowhere. So I guess big picture is what I'm concerned with.
Okay. Yeah, and looking at the history of human regulations of the sexual marketplace, while it's true, as libertine critics of quote unquote Puritan values say, that most of the world has not had these values, it's also true that most of the world has been a dunghill. And unless you want to go to poverty, squalor, tyranny, civil war, then the only regulation of the sexual marketplace that allows anything even close to what we take for granted in the United States today is that regulation of the sexual marketplace. Thanks again for everybody for coming on. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.